My name's Scott Leatham. So I'm a political ecologist by background, and luckily I don't go into theory too much in this, but what I really wanted to talk about was the first kind of model that I developed as part of my PhD a wee while ago, and actually what I think is probably the more interesting part of my research so far. So what I tried to do is basically I tried to say, well, is there a way that we can talk about greenwash effectively in a more kind of formalized manner so that we might be able to identify it quicker and better, and also more importantly identify forms of emergence that try to resist and counter greenwash. So what I did was to develop kind of a framework of 6 interrelated what I call fantasy logics of sustainable consumerism. So the reason for doing this was when I think about mediating environmental destruction, in climate change, social inequality, and so on and so forth, a lot of the time what we see in mainstream narratives in elite discourses is that actually it's consumerism and its markets and its forms of exchange that mediate our understanding of crisis and particularly of solutions. So we tend to understand crises as those of the market, that i.e. they exist outside the market as externalities, and all we need to do is simply bring them in and into the market, and therefore consumerism will take care of things. So one-dimensional sustainability, those of you who may have read Marcuse and so on might be familiar with one-dimensional man or one-dimensional human. There's not really any other comparison to make with Marcuse, but that particular metaphor is quite useful. Marcuse was talking about living in modernity. He was writing in the 60s. Living in modernity is about living within the confines of consumerism. The idea of, as we partake in society, we inherently partake in the social cues and so on of consumerism. So it's the idea that life is ruled by a kind of technocratic rationality. And that's really what I want to come back to when I'm talking about how we relate to nature, how we relate to sustainability, how we relate to potential solutions. So, as I mentioned, this kind of began as a broader research project, and this was kind of stage 1 of 3. I'm not going to go into much detail about the wider project unless people want me to later on. But effectively, I wanted to kind of assess the greenwash discourse and look at how we can identify the kind of mythical logics that pervade the consumer discourse. So to do this, basically it was a big discourse analysis. Again, I won't go into much detail at this point. But effectively in stage 1, I developed a large discourse analysis and a framework from that, which I then applied to what I saw as potential forms of counter hegemony discourses in some way. It isn't to say that the case study that I chose, ecological civilization, Shentang Wenming in China, it's not to say that that's a perfect discourse when it comes to sustainability, but what it was a kind of counter-hegemonic articulation. That is, it set itself up within China as being a kind of alternative to and almost against kind of Western sustainable development hegemonic discourse. So, like I say, I'm kind of building on political ecology, but the influences are quite critical theory. They're, Foucault, later Gramsci, Althusser, Weyer particularly, Ernest Leclerc, Chantal Mouffe, etc. A better comparison than Marcuse might be with Henri Lefebvre and Guy Debord and so on. So as I said, I kind of applied this to China, but what I really want to talk about is the actual framework itself. So I identified 6 what I call fantasy logics of sustainability. So the first one, active positive language. So this is the first one where I actually provide examples, because it's the one where everyone says, how can this really be the case? No one actually believes this. And this is something that's actually quite noticeable in green rhetoric, and kind of greenwash rhetoric, which is rather than presenting some kind of innovation or partial solution in terms of a kind of a relative gain, a lot of the time green solutions are presented as being a kind of a positive contribution. And so we see this particularly in car adverts, where bringing life back to the neighborhood is a genuine advert that I saw and kind of inspired this one on my walk to the university in Leicester in the UK. As giant advert, which is simply advertising a car, a normal petrol car as well, but slightly less emissions. And it said, by driving this, you are breathing life back into your neighborhood. And I thought this was a fascinating way to kind of construct this kind of active good that the citizenry is participating in as a consumer. And it's that consumer citizen subject that my thesis kind of built around. So one good example of this is a BMW advert. This aired in the UK in 2017. I should say this is one of many. There are about 100 analysed in total. So the BMW advert said, with 0 emissions, the i3, that's a car, is a clean car and helps to give back to the environment. So BMW actually came under a lot of pressure about this. And I mentioned before, one of the critiques of this work, which is totally fair, is that I didn't actually talk to any consumers, other than we're all consumers. I relied on the kind of the construction of the consumer as a subject position, in the sense of people like Althusser and so on. However, actually, we see evidence that people are articulating this. In fact, this is a good one, because this isn't actually by BMW. This was a customer of BMW who had bought the car and was talking back to BMW about it. And he was saying, it was a he, was saying, I think this car is a clean car and it helps me to give back to the environment. And of course, BMW ran with that in the advert. What was quite interesting was, of course, the advert actually got banned. And it's an incredibly specific case, because it hardly ever happens. But the advertising authority in the UK said, actually, that's not provable. This idea that it helps to give back to the environment could be understood by consumers to mean that owning and driving the car has a net benefit. And so I was talking about this a couple of years before I actually came across this example, but it highlighted perfectly the problem, and that apparently consumers are genuinely internalizing that narrative of being quite an active citizen in sustainability by purchasing a particular car. And it might go for any other kind of purchase. So that was number one, active positive language. I think it's fair to say that the titles of some of these aren't very catchy, and I might be able to change them. But one is active positive language. Number two that I identified was complexity reduction. So if anyone's read or heard of Seeing Like a State, then I effectively borrowed that idea that a particular actor sees the world in a particular way in order to make sense of it, in order to act on it, in order to reduce the amount of information out there so that it can be understandable and that it can be actionable. And so I derived kind of two issues going on here that reduce the complexity of sustainability, by which I mean all of its environmental, all of its social, all of its inequity problems. And we reduce that to something quite simple, the consumer act that helps to fix it, supposedly. And so Seeing Like a Marketer, this was this is where the problem becomes simplified in order to make it governable, in order to make it marketable, and particularly in order to make it exchangeable. Now, that's quite a simple thing, but the problem with that is, I later developed in a thesis, was that what that really alludes to is the kind of the epistemic violence by which we understand nature as something that is exchangeable and is tradable. And therefore, the kind of knowledge that we create about nature is by seeing as a marketer, even in states. And so I applied this more recently. I live in Scotland, so I applied it more recently to the rhetoric of the Scottish government. And I found that the results held. In fact, it was almost impossible to distinguish between an electric car advert and the Scottish government's own message. And I thought it was absolutely fascinating. I probably should include some examples from that, actually. But so seeing like a marketer wasn't simply the role of the marketer. It was the fact that that's how we've constructed knowledge. And it was also, that was how the state was seeing. And that was the case in Scotland. It was the case in the UK. So seeing like a consumer, it's a similar kind of process, but it's that absorption of the sign values that are conveyed by these acts. And so this kind of borrows a bit from people like Guy Debord and so on, the Society of the Spectacle. And so within this Society of the Spectacle, it's the consumer act, it's the inconspicuous consumerism, being seen to be being green is the most important aspect. And actually, it's possible to be seen to be being green without actually being sustainable. And that's a really key fact that I'm gonna come on to a bit later. And one of the ways I kind of thought about this was a simple thought experiment, really. If we imagine that green and being sustainable is a social reality, and sustainability is also a physical reality, that is, its biospherical limits and all the rest of it. And if we imagine something like air travel, and we know, for instance, that an incredibly small minority are responsible for the majority of air travel emissions. But if we take just one person and we say, well, that one person is going to fly everywhere. They're going to fly between the UK and America 3 times a week. If they're the only person doing it, then actually it's arguably sustainable. They could keep doing it. The resource demand simply isn't that significant for one person. But we would never class that behavior as being green. We would never class that person as being sustainable. And so there's this interesting kind of disconnect between what we perceive as sustainable and a potential reality of sustainability. Of course, once we involve scale and we scale that up and we say, well, that one person doing it might be okay, but 10,000 people, not so much. That's where the problem hits, of course. But we individualize sustainability, and a lot of that is a reflection of the Society of the Spectacle, whereby consumerism is how we mediate our understanding of sustainability.
Scott, can I ask you to speed up a bit, because your 15 minutes are ticking?
Okay, I'll be quick. So number 3 is economic rationalization. And this I've touched upon it a little bit already. It's the idea that actually this consumer subject is not acting as a sustainable subject. They're acting as an economic subject who is rational, and therefore they are economically rational rather than being environmentally rational. And number 4, representation and participation, kind of lies at kind of the heart of most of them and brings them together. What I argue is that the discourse is so prevalent that it works over time and space. And so I looked at the construction of future generations. Even though there's so much progressive, positive discourse around future generations and looking out for future generations and so on, a lot of the time in both policy levels and in marketing and so on, future generations are simply future consumers. And so we kind of extrapolate from our consumerism now, and we assume that those in the future will be acting in the same way and will be constructed in the same way. And spatially, in the majority world, we arguably simply the developing markets are simply future consumers as well. And so even as we kind of extend the kind of horizons of what sustainability will capture, it's really just about enlarging our horizon of consumerism. What's most important here is that it's the consumers who are the legitimate agent of change. And so by the kind of occlusion of other forms of participation in sustainability, we really are only left with consumers who are going to be the legitimate agent of change. And that's derived from a lot of the intergovernmental literatures, the OECD, the UNEP, and so on and so forth, where we literally have the phrase, consumers will drive the innovation that we all need. So consumers are essential in these discourses. I've already talked a bit about problem construction, so I'm just going to jump straight to open signification, which is the last one. So I think it's actually, this builds a little bit on the previous presentation as well. I argue that the idea of green is a highly cultivated aesthetic, and it's a highly multimedia discourse. What that actually means is it's very easy to be green in a social sense without being sustainability in any kind of ecological sense. This is really important because what we see in car adverts and so on, all the way back to studies from 2004 in Australia in the Toyota Prius, we see that green aesthetics are used instead of falsifiable statements. So just to wrap up, I make two conclusions. One is that because of the kind of the role that greenwash plays, it's possible for marketers and so on, and states, even consumers, to act according to green aesthetics, but not according to falsifiable statements. And then the second conclusion derives from this. It's that functional sustainability is one reality, and performative sustainability can be a very different social reality or set of realities. And this is what is derived from the communication and the mediation of being green in a sustainability transition. And of course, these two realities don't necessarily have anything in common. So I'm going to end there. I'm sorry, I may have run a few minutes over, so I apologize for that. But thank you.